Good evening. My task today is to say something about the role of noise in the arts. I think this question can be explored very well from the perspective of a theory of aesthetic eigenvalues, which you have studied in preparation. The theory explains the riddle of aesthetic experience in terms of the hyperfunctions and the dysfunctions that can arise in any perceptual apparatus, in humans and in animals alike. In that sense, my lecture is about noise in nature and art. You will surely have noticed that the term noise is used very ambivalently. That is why I would like to begin with a brief clarification of that concept. First of all, the term noise was introduced in information theory. The basic model here consists of a transmitter who sends a signal through a channel to a receiver. Each of these signal transmissions can be disturbed. The telephone line crackles and too much party noise disturbs the conversation. Noise here is an objective property of the channel, defined independently of the receiver. And the question that interests information theory most is this: under what conditions can one still communicate reliably through a noisy channel? In the context of theories of perception, too, there is talk of noise, but now noise changes its location. The starting point is the world, which is observed by a perceptual apparatus. Out of all the registered sensory stimuli, the apparatus then computes visual and acoustic figures. In perceptual terms, noise now becomes the background, or better, the background noise against which a figure can stand out. And finally, there is an aesthetic context. Instead of the overabundance of sensory stimuli streaming in on an observer, the perceptual apparatus now focuses on a single work of art. In the art context, the transmission channel is usually prepared so that these artworks cannot be disturbed by any environmental noise. The white cube excludes all visual stimuli, and the concert hall all acoustic stimuli that could otherwise add noise to the perception of the work. Everything that can be observed on an artwork now becomes aesthetically relevant. In modern art, this can lead to noise itself becoming the aesthetic material that is to be perceived and experienced. So much by way of preface on the different conceptual contexts of noise. Today we will be concerned above all with the third case, with noise in art. To that end, I will first present a general model of perception. Second, within this perceptual model, we can then locate the aesthetic eigenvalues, both for situations as they occur in nature and for the context of art. Perceptual processes, insofar as they concern the distant senses of hearing and seeing, can be described by a general two-pole model of perception. Living beings that can move about must necessarily also develop the capacity to perceive. The basal function of perception is gestalt-formation. With the help of their senses, animals must construct visual or acoustic figures in order to identify food, mates, and predators, to move toward them or to move away from them. Perceptual systems are therefore permanently occupied with constructing a difference between figure and ground, which, strictly speaking, is the difference between figure-capable and non-figure-capable sensory stimuli. These non-figure-capable stimuli are registered by the perceptual apparatus as noise. Besides gestalt formation, perceptual systems have developed a second mechanism, attention. Perception must be able to orient itself toward what is new, toward what suddenly appears on the perceptual horizon. The cat is chasing the mouse. The cat chasing the mouse must be able to react in time to the dog barking behind it. Gestalt formation and attention are evolutionary achievements of animals. They are perceptual functions. Aesthetic eigenvalues, by contrast, and that is the decisive idea of the theory, are dysfunctions or hyperfunctions of these two basal perceptual functions. So let us now look at the eigenvalues of perception as one encounters them in nature. On the gestalt side, the hyperfunction is a reinforced gestalt formation. Here you find figures of a heightened gestalt quality, and these are phenomena we perceive as especially beautiful. An example in nature would be the golden spiral in seashells, which is based on the golden section. The golden ratio is a very particular way of dividing a line in which the same proportion occurs twice. The perceptual apparatus has developed schemata for estimating proportions, and there are special proportions, such as the golden section, in which one and the same proportional scheme is stimulated twice over. The same principle explains the harmonious sound of musical intervals, such as the octave, the fifth, and the fourth. Hearing is likewise a part of the perceptual apparatus, which has developed, among other things, to register differences in pitch, that is, ratios of frequencies. In consonant intervals, two simultaneously sounding tones excite several interval schemes at once, because the tones stand in a special frequency relation. In the octave it is 2:1, and in the fifth it is 3:2. The theory of aesthetic eigenvalues, therefore, need not assume that there is an innate sense of beauty, as theories of evolutionary aesthetics presuppose. Instead, it explains beauty as a byproduct of the perceptual capacity of living beings, who, with the help of sense organs, construct figures out of the abundance of environmental stimuli. Just as bridges and washing machines, by virtue of their construction, have their eigenfrequencies at which they can resonate until they shake themselves apart, so perceptual systems, by virtue of their construction, have such eigenfrequencies or eigenvalues which are then experienced as aesthetic values. There is an analogous hyperfunction on the side of attention. The normal function of perception is to direct attention toward what is new. Whatever is new is a priori interesting for any living being that moves about. But there are events of an exceptional novelty that trigger an absolute interest. Lightning and thunder in a storm are such events. By their suddenness and intensity, they draw all perceptual resources to themselves. The golden ratio and the fifth carry more information than would be needed to recognize that proportion or that interval. In the same way, lightning and thunder carry a surplus of information that signals the novelty of these phenomena. Aesthetic beauty and the aesthetic event are therefore hyperfunctions that rest on an informational excess compared with ordinary perceptions. Dysfunctions, by contrast, arise from a deficit of information in the processes of gestalt formation and attention. At the bottom right, you see the owl from the title image. The owl's plumage merges with the bark of the tree. One sees the owl and one does not see it. The perceptual impression one gets of this image is, so to speak, extremely noisy. There is thus a deficit of perceptual information for distinguishing figure from ground. Not only the focusing of attention, but also the drifting of attention fulfills a biological function. Once a figure has been recognized as such, attention drifts away. In order to perceive figures in the environment that may be even more important or even vital for the animal. It is a survival advantage if antelopes do not only graze but from time to time shift their perceptual focus and scan the surroundings for lines. Perceptual ambivalences are aesthetically relevant as well. They hold attention, or rather they delay inattention and they delay boredom. The ambivalent phenomena remain interesting longer because they cannot be unambiguously identified as a figure. We keep looking until we can actually make out the blurred contours of the owl against the bark. At the bottom left you see an example of the sublime, the view across the boundless sea. Sublimity rests on the dysfunction too. Perception is prompted to form figures, but on the wide, empty surface of the water, it largely fails. The smooth expanse is ground without figure, a homogeneous, sustained stimulus to the perceptual apparatus whose evolutionary biological function is, in fact, that gestalt formation should arise within it. Sublimity is, in this respect, an infinite spinning of the process of gestalt formation. What one perceives is an anomaly, a suspended formation. Perception rests on two processes, gestalt formation and the concentration of attention. On the gestalt side, there are two anomalies. A reinforced gestalt formation, triggered by figures of a heightened gestalt quality, which we experience as beautiful, and a suspended gestalt formation, triggered by especially figureless perceptual impressions, which we experience as sublime. On the side of attention, we find two anomalies just as well. There is absolute attention triggered by events that demand our undivided interest, and there is delayed inattention triggered by aesthetic ambivalences that keep perception from drifting away. These four perceptual anomalies are accompanied by four different sensations or feelings. The beautiful gives pleasure, the event captivates our attention, aesthetic ambivalence we experience as tension, and the sublime is accompanied by astonishment. The sensations corresponding to the aesthetic eigenvalues are therefore pleasure, captivation, tension, and astonishment. Aesthetic eigenvalues can become evolutionary attractors in nature, where the point is to draw the attention of mates. Animals such as the peacock can develop an especially beautiful ornamental plumage. Where, on the other hand, the point is to reduce one's own perceptibility to predators or to prey, animals such as the owl can maximize the aesthetic value of ambivalence and thereby camouflage themselves. Cultural evolution can connect to these four eigenvalues as well, as you can see here at first glance. The pre-modern arts unfolded around the pre-modern arts unfolded around the eigenvalue of beauty. The modern arts, by contrast, set in with the negation of that traditional aesthetic value. The art of classical modernism begins by exploring alternative aesthetic eigenvalues and developing isms like expressionism and cubism. There are many mixed forms, but in principle, expressionism is based on the aesthetic event, cubism on the aesthetic eigenvalue of ambivalence, and Jackson Pollock's large-formed drip paintings on the eigenvalue of the aesthetically sublime. The theory of aesthetic eigenvalues sketched here draws on insights from various scientific aesthetics: imperial aesthetics, mathematical aesthetics, psychological aesthetics, gestalt theory, neuroaesthetics, and evolutionary aesthetics. What is philosophical about the eigenvalue theory lies in integrating all these scientific theories into a general aesthetics of perception. The theory is also suited to the analysis of artwork. For this, however, we have to bridge a language barrier. This language barrier lies between the language of the sciences and the language of art criticism. What you see here is a model that allows us to overcome that barrier. The idea is that each of the four aesthetic eigenvalues can be described as the interplay of two parameters anchored in our lived experience and anchored in our everyday language. Beauty can be described as the interplay of order and contrast. The event is the interplay of suddenness and intensity. Ambivalence is the interplay of indeterminacy and alienation, and sublimity can be described as the interplay of formlessness and infinity. In all these cases, one can carry out a thought experiment that shows these parameters are indeed complementary, and that the aesthetic eigenvalues cannot be reduced to a single one. Take the eigenvalue of beauty. A pattern can exhibit a high degree of order, but if the contrast between its compositional elements is only weakly pronounced, then it lacks pregnance and does not appear beautiful. Conversely, a drip painting by Jackson Pollock possesses many color contrasts, but these color spots seem entirely random, and for this lack of order, they are likewise not experienced as beautiful. Or take the aesthetic eigenvalue of the event. A sudden stimulus of low intensity, such as a shout amid street noise, lacks the intensity to perceived as an event. And likewise, an intense permanent stimulus, as a loud jet engine on an airport, lacks the suddenness to be perceived as an event. Equipped with this analytic instrument, we can now take up the question of what role noise plays in art. Beauty can be reconstructed as the interplay of order and contrast. In beautiful artworks, both parameters are maximized. Take, for example, this medieval altarpiece by Simone Martini and Lippo Memmi. The ornament is the very epitome of beauty, for it heightens both the degree of order through repetition and the contrast between the repeated elements. Thus, the painting imitates the Gothic tracery of a church. In addition, there is a circular ornament of angels here in the middle, and this angel flying around a dove, meaning the Holy Spirit. And there is a multitude of symmetries in the painting too. Moreover, one can make out two golden sections here, marked by the red vertical lines and defined by the piers of the tracery. In the left golden section, the most important figure of the painting is placed, the Archangel Gabriel. But where is the noise left in this painting? When the aesthetic eigenvalue of beauty is maximized in this classical sense, we have noise-free images. The fewest perceptual apparatus does, of course, permanently construct the difference between figure and ground, but in such paintings, the ground of the image is itself determined once more. In this case, it is the gold ground, which in medieval painting symbolizes the foreshadowing of paradise. In nature, noise-free perception do not exist. Figures always stand out against a background that, from a lived perspective, has no figure-forming capacity. In a beautiful painting, by contrast, every point in the image owes itself to a decision about form. Both medieval and early modern art differentiated themselves around the eigenvalue of beauty, which is why in German the arts were referred to as die schöne Künste, literally the beautiful arts. The English term is the fine arts, but again, what is meant are the arts whose end lies in the aesthetic value of beauty. The moment the arts became autonomous and modern, they also became free. To negate their own guiding idea, namely that an artwork must necessarily be beautiful. The art of the so-called classical modernism, which emerged at the end of the 19th century, was determined to be radically new. It is still aesthetic art, only that this modern art no longer crystallizes around the eigenvalue of beauty, but instead around the specifically modern aesthetic eigenvalues of the sublime, of the event, and of the aesthetic ambivalence. The step into aesthetic modernity was first taken at the eigenvalue of the sublime. The two constitutive parameters here are formlessness and infinity. There are some indications of such a determination in Kant, who says, quote, "The beautiful in nature concerns the form of the object, which consists in limitation. The sublime, by contrast, is to be found even in a formless object, insofar as boundlessness is represented in it. Infinity cannot be perceived, that's why Kant speaks of boundlessness in our imagination. The horizon at sea we can associate with an infinitely great distance." Caspar David Friedrich was a forerunner and model for modern artists, which becomes especially evident in this painting, The Monk by the Sea of 1810. It is a self-reflexive painting. It shows a monk undergoing an experience of the sublime as he gazes into the distance of the sea, and the painting itself has a sublime effect on the viewer. The monk in the foreground is very small in relation to the whole, and thus becomes the measure of composition. Compared with the tiny figure of the monk, the horizon appears infinitely far and the sky above the sea infinitely vast. The tiny figure, so to speak, calibrates the pictorial space to infinity. The monk gives perception the unit of measure, by which the depth of the seascape can be felt, or, to put it with Kant, the small figure helps us to represent the sea as boundless. The infrared photography is revealing. One can make out ships in the middle ground that Friedrich first sketched and painted over here and there. My explanation for this overpainting would be this. The ships generate a figure representation or a figure perception and would thereby weaken the parameter of formlessness and consequently the experience of the aesthetically sublime as well. And I think Friedrich was interested in the sublime. The parameter of formlessness describes a perceptual mode in which all gestalt formation fails. In everyday perception, this would be that ground against with which figure can stand out. It would be that noise which has no value for gestalt formation and can therefore be filtered out and goes unperceived. In art, by contrast, this noise can itself be made the theme and can trigger an aesthetic experience of the sublime. Caspar David Friedrich's Monk by the Sea is a precursor work of modern art. Only 3 decades later did William Turner, with Snowstorm, create a painting that exploits the aesthetic eigenvalue of the sublime with the same radicality. Here again, the 2 parameters of formlessness and infinity are characteristic. There are no clearly identifiable forms. The boat dissolves almost entirely into the sea, and the sea can scarcely be distinguished from the sky. The impression of infinity is conveyed not by an infinitely great distance, as in the Monk by the Sea, but by the suggestion of infinitely great forces. In the critique of the power of judgment, Kant distinguishes these 2 manifestations of the sublime. In this sense, the Monk by the Sea would be an example of the mathematically sublime, which encounters the impression of infinite distances, and Snowstorm, by contrast, would be an example of the sublime of great forces, which Kant calls the dynamically sublime. For our theme, the painting is interesting for a further reason. Not only does it maximize the parameter of formlessness, but this formlessness is associated with the lived experience of noise. The stormy sea is itself the very image of noise. In both Friedrich and Turner, the sublime paintings still have remnants of figure and still work beneath the surface with an aesthetic of the beautiful. The sublime in a purified form is realized only in the artworks of aesthetic modernism, as for instance in Jackson Pollock's Number 1. In this strip painting, formlessness becomes the principle of composition. And the impression of infinity arises because this large format picture offers infinitely many occasions for gestalt formation, all of which run into the void. Strictly speaking, we are dealing here with a third manifestation of the sublime, the sublime of great number. In nature, one encounters this experience, for instance, when looking up into the starry sky. In everyday life, one would ignore a perceptual impression like this as visual noise. But in the art context, this noise now turns itself into an aesthetic material that is to be perceived. And once one adopts the viewer's perspective of art, one notices that a picture which combines the experience of formlessness with the experience of infinity has a sublime effect. The two parameters by which a perception can be described and analyzed as an event are suddenness and intensity. A fine example of such an art of the event is Franz Kleine's painting Black and White No. 2, which aims to trigger a sudden and an intense perception. The aspect of suddenness comes into play because one has never before seen such a visual stimulus, one that has no defined gestalt qualities. And the aspect of intensity is maximized in that Kleine chooses the strongest visual contrast, that is the contrast between black and white. Moreover, it is a large format painting over 2 meters high, and size 2 intensifies perceptual impression. Works centered on the eigenvalue of the event are once again noise-free. Attention focuses solely on a sudden perceptual stimulus that refuses gestalt formation. Moreover, the perception is so intense and so overwhelming that attention cannot turn toward the background of the event. The last eigenvalue of perception is aesthetic ambivalence. Its two parameters are indeterminacy and alienation. George Braque's Violin and Jug presents us with a perceptual riddle. We try to see the jug and the violin named in the title, but these figures can be perceived only in fragments. Such visual ambivalences arise through the combination of techniques of indeterminacy and of alienation. On the one hand, Braque dissolves the most fundamental distinction of painting, the distinction between figure and ground. To this end, analytic cubism uses no colors, but only grays and browns. This lack of color contrast heightens the indeterminacy of the figure. On the other hand, cubism follows an abstract concept, namely to depict an object simultaneously from different points of view. Such an unnatural mode of depiction makes it difficult to identify a figure as such. In this respect, cubism employs a technique of alienation, in the sense in which Bertolt Brecht spoke of the alienation effect in theater. If in the lived world one were to perceive a violin and a jug under poor visibility, then one could say that such a blurred perception was extremely noisy. In art, however, such a noisy perception takes on a specific meaning. It becomes the occasion for an experience of ambivalence, whose aesthetic value lies in the fact that such a perceptual ambivalence remains interesting longer. The picture holds more tension than if the two figures had been paintedly realistically and one could recognize them immediately. With that, I have reached the end of my lecture. The basal function of perception is to generate figures out of an overabundance of sensory stimuli. Perception thus permanently constructs a distinction between figure and ground. But since perceiving also includes the capacity to direct attention toward whatever lies in the perceptual horizon, this background of gestalt-formation remains always present as background noise in our everyday experience. Both the art of the beautiful and the art of the event make this background noise disappear. In the one case, the formation processes are so reinforced in the image that the ground itself turns into a meaningful figure. And in the other case, the event floods perception with stimuli before any distinction between figure and ground can be made. In sublime art and in the art of ambivalence, the processes of gestalt formation either fail or they are blocked. In the one case, as in the other, perception stays focused on what in lived experience or in lived perception would be mere background noise. This background noise can, under certain conditions, trigger an aesthetic feeling of astonishment or tension, so that such perceptions appear sublime or ambivalent. Noise, in short, is negated in the hyperfunction of perception, and noise is sublimated in the dysfunctions of perceptions. The theory behind all this is developed in the first part of my book, Gehaltsästhetik, a philosophy of art, in case you would like to follow the argument further. But now I'm curious about your perspective. Thank you very much for your attention and for the invitation, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thanks.